This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to our good friends Caleb and Andrew Cotter, hosts of the Iroquois History and Legends podcast. Links to learn more about the Cotter brothers and their podcast can be found at www.longhousepodcast.com or in the show notes. Today's episode is a continuation of the conversation we started in the last episode. You can easily enjoy these episodes separately, but they go really well together. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon by going over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen. And you go a long way to helping keep this show sustainable for long in the future by supporting it. And of course, a special thanks goes out to our supporter Alex at the executive producer level. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast, can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen and how to contact me and support the show by just going over to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. Monroe ultimately has to surrender. Was that an actual surrender? Did that whole battle for Fort William Henry happen in real life?
Yes, we actually have an episode called Fort William Henry, and we see that Colonel Monroe is given many opportunities to surrender, and he keeps refusing, even though he eventually finds out that reinforcements aren't coming, even though his bastions are falling and he's outnumbered, he just continues to refuse to surrender. At one point, Montcalm comes up to him and he asks for surrender and he says no, and he starts to walk away. And this is where something comes into the movie that actually happened. He says, okay, we're going to go back into the fort and fight to the death. And Montcalm says, please, sir, I have a message for you, a letter from General Webb.
And what did the letter say?
Well, the letter said, hang in there, I'll be there in 15 minutes with reinforcements.
Oh, cool.
No, it didn't say that. It actually said, Dear Colonel Monroe, we have reinforcements, but I don't feel like sending them, so try and get a good terms for a surrender. Love, General Webb.
Why does Webb leave them hanging 12 miles? Okay, yeah, I mean, we can drive 12 miles in like 10 minutes. So, I mean, if you're pushing it back then, it might have taken them a day.
People have been pondering that for hundreds of years. Me personally, I think that he's still got Braddock's defeat in his mind. When Braddock was marching through the Ohio Territory, it was the fact that they were all stretched out in a long column that they were so vulnerable to Indian attack. I think he's picturing, if I try and move my forces here, they're going to get attacked on the road, and then I'm going to look like the bumbling idiot. So I think he would rather Colonel Monroe look like the bumbling idiot, and then, he can take things from there. That's my guess. There's probably some other things that went into place, but we have the letters we covered in some of our other episodes where we actually have the letters back and forth between Monroe and Webb, and constantly Monroe saying, please send forces, and he just is not having any of it, even though they're very close.
Could Webb have done something? Would he have weakened his position he was at Fort George, right?
He was at Fort Edward.
He was at Fort Edward. Could he have actually helped out Monroe, or would that have weakened his position too much at Fort Edward?
Only if he was defeated, because, like we said, this is a choke point. There's no French going to invade from the south. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if he went up there and his army was defeated, then theoretically the French could come down, take Fort Edward, and move on to Albany. But
that's a lot of
they don't have to. They could leave 2 men back at the fort, and they don't have to worry about anybody coming in from any other direction. No.
We have the scene where Monroe does have to quit. Maybe we can discuss that a little bit, why he has to surrender. What forces him? His hand is basically forced.
Colonel Monroe, he's kind of a tough old Scotsman, and you do get that impression in the movie. He's tough. He's not going to surrender. He's willing to go down for honor. He's willing to die for honor to defend the fort. And he's shown that to Montcalm. And Montcalm is starting to run a little low on supplies. He still has in a lot better shape than Colonel Monroe. But Monroe basically tells him, I'm not going to send all of my men to go on your prison ships for the next 3 years, because prison ships are not a good place. In fact, about 3/4 of the people that go on prison ships a lot of times die because there's no air conditioning on prison ships and there's no food on prison ships. So in the movie, he turns from Montcalm and he says, I'm going to go in there, we'll dig our graves and we'll fight to the death. And at which point Montcalm steps forward and says, please, monsieur, please at least listen to what I have to say. You will not be prisoners. You will sign that you will not fight for the rest of the war. You will get to keep all your arms. You will get to keep all of your flags, because just like in Roman times, you got to keep your colors. That was a big, big thing. As long as you could keep your flags and your colors and carry them back, you still had your honor. All of the militia, everybody will get to keep their personal property, and the militia will just have to sign something saying that they will go back to their farms and farm in peace. That really happened. Monroe, he turns around in the movie and he says, let me talk to my officer. We're doing this because we're not getting any better. All they basically asked was for the fort, and the fort has been completely blown to smithereens at this point. And Webb even says that at this point. He says, my orders are from the king that you should leave this area. So I'm perfectly happy as long as you leave. He can claim that he was victorious. And meanwhile, they can all save face, and they only have to march 12 miles south down to Fort Edward.
One scene that really happened that's not in the movie that I think should have made them was the dinner scene. Because in real life, after this, Monroe and Montcalm and their officers sit down, they set up a table outside the fort, candlelight, fine china, everything, and they have a meal together while the French native allies stand.
Oh, is there any perspective from the Indian side of what they thought about that?
Yes. They did not like it.
No, I can't imagine.
Because remember how we mentioned earlier that a lot of these people came from Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois? They walked all this way to help the French out because they had alliances with them, and they were promised to be paid in the spoils of war. And they marched all the way here and got nothing. And in the movie, Magua kind of hints at this. Magua's in it for revenge, but his troops also want spoils because he comes to Montcalm later that night in the night, and that's the famous scene where Magua tells his backstory. But he says, the white men sit and dine, and the Indians have no scalps.
The spoils, well, spoils are scalps, but you're not expecting very much if you just take a fort. Were they expecting that they'd be able to get into the frontier villages and do spoils? Like, what were they looking for in spoils?
They were probably promised the moon. You know, whenever people sign up for war, they tell them, oh, you know, you'll get whatever. But pretty much they're looking for everyday products that we would think of. Knives, tomahawks, clothes, guns.
A lot of them are still having to deal with deer skins. A lot of these people live in colder climates where they don't have good clothes. So just killing somebody and taking their entire set of clothes, that was a lot of money. It was just like in the Oregon Trail game where clothes were where it was at. You could get more money selling clothes to Indians than you could any other thing because they didn't have looms and everything set up in America yet. They had to import everything from Europe.
And you sort of alluded to the fact that the Native Americans weren't very happy about how this whole thing went down. In the movie, they have a scene where Montcalm and Magua are hashing it out. And Montcalm, he's not very convinced that the British are just going to go home, like he said. So what happens in that scene? And how can we tie that into maybe how the Native Americans would have really felt after one of these things where they're basically told, we're going to give you this, but in the end, you don't get any of it, and go take a hike.
This is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. And I think that the majority of it probably isn't accurate. But what happens is, like you said, Magua is meeting with Montcalm, and Montcalm basically tells him, my hands are tired because I have this thing, French honor, and we made peace, so I can't do anything. And then he kind of winks at Magua and says, but there's nothing stopping you from doing anything. And then he has a little smile on his face as he sneaks into the night and disappears.
The scene with Magua talking to Montcalm, I thought that was really interesting because the dynamic between Magua and Montcalm, they're almost talking to each other like equals, but he's kind of taking a little bit of a subservient role, but not really. And with Montcalm, he's dealing fairly with Magua, where he's basically stabbed Monroe in the back in this scene. What were the relationships between, especially the French and their native allies? It seemed a little bit more collegial than the British had with their native allies.
That's a great point. And I think that does a good job showing why so many more of the Native Americans in the Northeast were drawn to the relationships with the French because they were willing to treat them on an equal level. Champlain mentioned when he met with them that your daughters will marry my sons will marry your daughters. Really great words implying on how they're all equal and how they can become friends. And there was a lot of that still going on this couple hundred years later, where the French were just better at respecting the beliefs and really nurturing friendships with these people.
There was a dynamic where the Native Americans called the French general or governor Ananteo, which meant father. And we kind of hear, when you hear the term Great White Father, you kind of think, okay, all right, what is this? But it really was a more equality thing where a father is taking care of his children, not taking care of them like I know what's best for you, taking care like looking after them, presenting gifts and trade goods and having a good ongoing relationship, that kind of father-child relationship versus the father saying, you need to move 500 miles west now.
Yeah. And also a father-son relationship was something very different to a colonial family, to a Native American family, because they were raised in a clan system where uncles and mothers and everybody had much more of an influence on your day-to-day life than your father. Your father was basically, a background person that, like Andrew said, would look after you.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. And the French and the British really were both hierarchical as all get out, so you're not really saying that. It's just using different terminology. It's not like the king really is like a father or a way high-ranking governor in general. They're just not using the terminology father when it's really almost the same relationship.
So after the fort is finally surrendered, the British are going to march back to Fort Edward. And how many miles did we say it was?
12 miles.
12 miles. So they're going to march out, and they're going to leave some of their sick and wounded behind, and Montcalm has assured Colonel Monroe that they will be well taken after, and you are allowed to head out unmolested. Meanwhile, during the movie, Hawkeye has been put in chains, and they're going to eventually execute him when they get back to Fort Edward because they found out that he was involved in the conspiracy for the militia to get out. So he's being let out. And so you kind of see this train of people going out in the movie, which I think shows a very accurate description of how it went. You see British redcoats, you see Monroe on his horse, you see women and children who are like the fort helpers. You see Africans that are there as slaves or indentured servants. And you see native allied Indians there marching, all in this British column, marching out. So it's very accurate, the demographical makeup of the fort.
Plus, they're going 12 miles. It's not like they're marching to the ends of the moon. I mean, somebody could run 12 miles in an hour. Not me, but somebody could technically.
One of the things that Colonel Monroe brought up to Montcalm is, we need our powder out there because we could be attacked by the Indians. And Montcalm says, don't worry, I made all the chiefs promise that they would not attack you. And he actually did. The chiefs didn't do a very good job at talking to their warriors and making sure their warriors promised. But yeah, they had all their weapons with them. They were in good health. They had assurances from the chiefs and the French that they wouldn't be attacked. So nobody was really expecting anything.
So in the movie, Magua is there, and it really is an amazing scene. The way they film it looks like there's literally hundreds of Native Americans here hiding in the woods. And they've got them flanked on both sides, and the columns walking through this open area in between two forests. And then they're just marching, and they're really sad because they just lost. And this one brave comes running out and just bashes somebody in over the head. It's like, huh, what's going on? And then another one happens. And a chilling war cry comes out from both sides of the woods, and everybody's looking around. I can just feel your heart starts pounding. Oh no, oh no. They hear the stories of what's happened before to Braddock and these other people. And then you just see puffs of smoke and clouds, and you hear the whiz of bullets, and they're getting laid into on both sides. And then once the muskets fire, everybody just charges in, and it's a melee. It's an amazing scene.
How does that line up to what really happened after the surrender of Fort William Henry?
It's quite different. There was kind of a massacre, but it wasn't a planned attack on the column itself. Like we said, there was this group of angry Native Americans who were promised plunder to take back to their families, and they've gotten nothing. So they are really angry at Montcalm, and Montcalm has just said, you guys better not do anything. And they said, oh, okay. As all of the column leaves the fort, who's going to be in the back?
Women, children.
And the sick.
Yeah.
So that's what ends up happening. And how it starts is these Indians go up to the back of the column, and they basically just start grabbing stuff off their wagons.
They'll take a hat, or they'll take something laying down, or if you've got a sidearm, they'll just grab that. So they're just coming along and they're just grabbing it.
Violently. And the majority of the troops, picture 3,000 people stretched out on a little road. The people at the far end probably can't even hear gunshots coming from the back of the column. It's so far away. And they kind of caught that in the movie, in the scene where the guy comes up and bashes somebody. The line is starting to think, hey, is something going on back there? But nobody really knows. But they didn't actually do a full-out attack on the actual British Redcoats. They were attacking the people in the back of the column. And it starts with just taking a few things. But then things start to escalate. And they escalate when supposedly a Huron warrior grabs an infant from a mother's arms because she wouldn't give him, whatever she had that he wanted. They said it was a shawl. And he dashes the infant to the ground, killing it instantly. And then all of a sudden, as soon as he does that, everyone just starts attacking, one way to another.
In real life, Monroe gets on his horse and starts riding around and telling the people, do not fight back, do not resist, do not escalate this, give them whatever they want. They just want your stuff and they'll leave us alone. But when somebody's up in your face, how do you really listen to that?
What happens? What's the fate of that column in real life?
They did portray this, especially English propagandists, as a huge dishonor on the French. They implied that Montcalm worked with the Indians to get them while they were down after promising peace. And they said that, they lost half of the men. Realistically, I think they're thinking a couple hundred people were killed.
And that number may be even lower. It could be in the dozens of range, because it's hard to get a number because several people were actually kidnapped and taken back to villages as captives. When the British get a hold of this and they publish it in the newspapers, they say that 3,000 people are massacred. And when you hear that number, you're just like, oh my goodness, those dirty, sneaky French sicking those Indians loose. And so that's where this story comes from. But in reality, it didn't happen. And in fact, in real life, this is a huge shame for Montcalm, and Montcalm has to ask these Indians that have captured all these people to return them, and he personally has to dole out money and presents and items to ransom them back, as many as he possibly can, because he's worried about what's going to be printed about him.
So the movie kind of tapped into that propaganda element really well with it. It just so happened that it just didn't happen that way.
But it makes for a more entertaining scene. But yes, it's total British propaganda. Did not happen that way at all.
So we pretty much talked about that this ambush didn't happen as such, but Magua gets his revenge against Monroe, who he refers to as the white hair throughout the movie. That scene where he kills Monroe taps into a lot of the things that a lot of the cultural elements that the Native Americans had. What did Magua happen to do to Monroe?
Well, in the movie, he shoots his horse out from underneath him and comes up on him, tells him that he's going to kill him and then he's going to kill his daughters. And I just wanted to let you know that before you die.
FYI.
And then he takes out his knife and proceeds to carve a hole in his chest and reach between his ribs and pull out his heart while he's staring up. And the last thing he sees is him holding his heart. So that really happened, right, Caleb?
It may have, but I don't know how. If it did happen, it happened back in a hospital where Monroe was sitting in Fort Edward 3 weeks later, because Monroe didn't die during the ambush. He was perfectly fine at the far south end of the column, leaving the fort. He probably didn't even see any of this fighting going on. By the time he got there, the Indians had already taken all their stuff and left. So he actually died weeks later after this.
And of natural causes or an illness.
Unless, Magua really sneaked into his window, cut out his heart, and made it look like he just died of dysentery.
So I guess we'll leave that one open. We don't know what happened. Nobody knows at all. After Hawkeye,
Chingachgook and Uncas and Hayward and the girls,
they escape, and there's all sorts of like cool chase scenes in canoes down waterfalls. Eventually, though, Hawkeye knows that they're for the lack of a better word, screwed, that they're going to get caught one way or the other. So Hawkeye's plan is to just let them get caught, and Alice, Cora, and Major Duncan get brought back to a Huron village. That Huron village scene, that actually seems to have captured a lot of what was going on and how the Native Americans related to war captives. What happened in that scene, and what can we maybe learn a little bit more about how something like that would have happened?
That was a cool scene, and there was actually a lot more to it, just like you mentioned. When they're there, they're hiding in a waterfall with the beautiful Monroe daughters and everything, and they're like, we can't do anything here, so we should leave. And then we'll come and try and rescue you later by talking to the chief. That actually made sense, because when the Huron warriors rush in, they're there for war. But if you let them capture the daughters and take them to the chief, and then you can get an audience with their sachem or their chief and explain the situation or offer to ransom them, all of a sudden you're then a diplomat. And that was kind of the goal with that. If we can get there and have an actual discussion, not on the warpath, people will listen to us. But right now, when they're there to fight, it doesn't matter what you say, they're not going to listen to you because they're there to fight. This is warfare. But yeah, when they take them to the Huron village, it really does kind of show the different clashes of cultures and everything, because you have Hawkeye, who's British or white but raised by Indians, asking the English guy to translate French to the Huron chief, and that's just a really cool scene where there are all these different cultures there put in the village.
One cool thing about that scene that I like to point out is Hawkeye sees that they're there. The girls and Duncan are captured and standing before the sachem and the council. And Hawkeye comes in, and he just comes walking in. And what's he holding in his hand, Caleb, when he walks in?
He's holding a wampum belt.
Oh, yeah.
That shows who he's from, who his people.
So for those of you that don't know what wampum is, a lot of people think it's Indian money. No. Wampum is shelled beads taken from Quahog down in the Chesapeake Bay, and then it's filed down and made into these little purple-white beads. And the patterns were shown to be what tribe or nation or clan you were from and who you were representing. And so whenever you showed up somewhere, you always showed your wampum. It was like your passport. It was your driver's license. It showed your credentials. And so he understands that if he just shows up as this white guy, well, who's this spy here? But he's holding a wampum belt, and he says, I'm here to conduct official diplomacy. Now, at the same time, he's being molested as he comes in. People are trying to beat him with war clubs. One guy actually slashes his chest open a little bit. That was probably from warriors that had seen him on the path and they were fighting him. In reality, if he's doing that, you're not supposed to touch him. So that's actually showing that these warriors are actually dishonoring him, and probably why the sachem talks them down once he shows up there. But again, it shows his resolve because he stands back up each time and keeps walking. And so that's telling the warriors that he is a brave and that he deserves respect. And so they calm down once they see that they've put him through this gauntlet.
One question I had, this scene, for being pretty short, it's probably only maybe 10 minutes-ish in the whole movie, but there's a lot to dissect in it. That Huron village, would there have been a Huron village? That was a fully developed village. There was a lot of houses, a lot of women, children, men. Would there have been one in New York, so close to, that's pretty southern New York. It's northern, but it's the southern end of northern New York.
Where this scene comes from is the book. And in the book, Magua kidnaps the daughters, and for weeks, they are tracking them back to Canada, at which point they get to the Huron village. And there's actually a Delaware and a Huron village, and they actually split up and go and talk to the sachems. So I think that when they made the movie, they didn't appreciate that, hey, this will look like they're, 2 miles away, and they just ran after them. When in reality, in the book, they went all the way across Lake Ontario is where this took place.
Also in that scene, like you had said, the sachem speaks Huron and French. Daniel Day-Lewis Hawkeye speaks English and Mohican. The Major Duncan speaks French and English, obviously. So nobody really speaks the same language there. And Major Duncan has to do the translating to iron out this deal. And the end of the line deal is that Hawkeye wants to give himself up to the tribe because Magua needs some sort of human punishment, I guess, to fulfill his honor. What was the honor code amongst braves like that? Because it seemed very complicated. Even in the movie, it was kind of hard to get what Magua wanted out of that.
I can break it back down to what we've already talked about with adoption. there were two kinds of adoption in the culture. One, which we mentioned, where you could take somebody that was captive and assimilate them into your culture and they could be the replacement. And the second was you could get your revenge through adoption.
Ritual torture, basically. Torturing someone so that they feel pain would relieve your pain. So once somebody else suffered, all of a sudden, okay, I can put this behind me. And the sachem even says that at one point. He says, okay, you can take the dark-haired daughter back, but the other one, Magua will take to heal his heart, he puts it.
So he gets, one of them will be tortured and burned, and one Magua will get to adopt. And, he put his wife.
In the book, he really did want her to be his wife, but
yes.
He wanted to basically make her subservient to him.
Mm-hmm. But in that culture, that's not really how it would have worked out. She would have been adopted as a daughter or a sister, not as a wife, because it's a matrilineal society, and so you couldn't force a woman, even a white woman, to marry you. It just wasn't it's not part of their culture.
Yeah, it seemed like they were probably taking something that was stretched out and condensing it, because Magua, it kind of alludes to it that he wants to be brought into that sachem's tribe. And so that sachem was kind of arbitrating a deal that maybe he didn't necessarily have anything to say in it, but they're all agreeing to have him arbitrate it. Is that how it would have worked? Who actually would have figured out, like, who got to who got to have revenge, who got to get married?
And this would not happen in a 5-minute conversation. Yeah. This would take place over days. But it probably would have worked out to some kind of compromise in the end, because usually what we say is, diplomacy is everyone agreeing to everything that everyone doesn't want to have happen. And when you look at what happened, nobody was happy. Magua wasn't happy. The girls weren't happy. Hayward wasn't happy. And Hawkeye isn't happy. And so they're all going through their own ways to try and remedy the situation that the sachem has decreed.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. The British major who is doing the translating, he decides that he's going to put himself up for the ritual revenge so that Hawkeye can escape. That substitution, that was okay the way in their culture that one person could substitute, and that actually would have made everything cool, for the lack of a better word.
At one point, Hawkeye says, I am the son of this Mohican, and he was known as the Long Rifle. A lot of the Huron hated him. He was this great enemy of theirs. So he claimed, my death would be a great honor to you. So one death would not necessarily be as good as another death. But I think the way that they looked at it was, hey, this is a British major. So I think they looked at it like it's a comparable trade and it would help the healing process.
Plus, Hayward mistranslated everything, so he didn't even give the whole impression that Hawkeye was the better choice. He gave the impression that he was the better choice.
I did enjoy that part of the scene because they did, for some reason, kind of make Duncan Hayward into kind of a jerk. And I appreciated how they kind of said, okay, he does have some honor. He's willing to sacrifice himself so that the girls will have a better chance to escape. I think it implied that he realized Hawkeye is the only one that could have a chance to saving them, because he's a forest guy and he can go and track them down and save her, and he knows that he can't do that. So I enjoyed how they put that in there.
And it's also interesting to think that as Hawkeye is leaving, he gets out his musket ball, and it's probably, I'd say, the second most dramatic scene in the movie, where he turns back and he fires his rifle and it shoots Hayward in the skull, killing him before he can be totally tortured.
That's what I was wondering about that scene, is that torture is ritualized. They're roasting him off, and, they're not killing him quickly. Did Hawkeye steal some of the honor that they were trying to get out of it?
Realistically, the pain that somebody suffers is part of the ceremony. And a lot of people early colonists noted how if they captured somebody from another village, they would stand there and make no noise as they were being tortured to death. And that showed that he had good honor. He didn't squeal at all when we tortured him.
And this torture wasn't, Hayward, they had the fire already going in that scene, but honestly, it would have been a lot slower. They would have started out cutting him or taking little sticks that had been poked in the fire and poking him, and they would have drawn it out. It just shows them hoisting him up, and I don't want to be burned in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 1 hour. Either way, I'd say, yes, please put a bullet between my ears. Please do that.
Realistically, they would have been mad if somebody shot their torture guy in the head. But if he was 300 yards away throughout all the commotion, it's possible they wouldn't have even noticed it.
Yeah. The next scene is there's another big chase scene through the mountain ridge. And this is the final scene. This is where it all comes down. You didn't like that scene at all, is what you were telling us?
This scene, Steve, is every time I watch it, if I was just to take this 10-minute scene and put it together, it just gets my gut every time. They're chasing, it's Chingachgook, Uncas, and Hawkeye chasing Magua and his scouts, trying to recapture the one sister. And the one thing that hits me immediately is the scenery and the music.
That's right. The scenery is just these beautiful mountains surrounded by a skirt of forest. And as they're chasing the Huron scouts, they're climbing the mountain. And as they continue to climb the mountain, the music continues to climb in volume and speed until the battle commences. When Uncas and
Chingachgook
and Hawkeye show up to rescue Alice, the younger daughter, and a great fight scene breaks out. The problem was Uncas got there first. And because it kind of implies that he has this love relationship with the younger daughter, so he outran the two older people because he's the younger warrior, and he gets there and he's able to defeat 3 braves in a row before he gets to Magua. And at which point you have this really great equal battle where there's 2 warriors both in their prime
on the edge of a cliff.
And it's looking like Uncas is going to be successful until Magua manages to get a stab wound right into him, right into his chest. And Uncas kind of just stands there as he's looking into the eyes of the girl that he's trying to save. And he goes to his knees. And it's just a really powerful scene. And Magua just looks at him with disgust and kicks him over. All while Alice is watching this. Once Uncas falls, Alice walks to the edge of the cliff. And Magua goes to grab her hand because it implies that he wanted her to be his wife. And she just stands there like a statue. There's like a single tear falling from her eye. And she looks down the cliff where her love, Uncas, fell and looks back at Magua and then just jumps off the... Meanwhile, Hawkeye and Uncas's father have just gotten into sight of this, so he gets to see his son fall from the cliff as they're just 100.
And you just hear him shout out, Uncas! But even now as we're recording this, I just feel my hair standing on end because it's such a powerful scene watching your brother or your son die.
And in the book, it was even more powerful because in this, at the end of the movie, Uncas's father, in the end, he says how he's the last of the Mohicans. In the book, he's always bragging on everyone about his son Uncas, who was this great warrior, as Uncas last of them. And now he's just lost his son, his pride and joy, and he has to see him fall.
The future of his people.
The scene of finally Uncas's dad gets there. And I almost felt that Magua gave up when he knew that Chingachgook, he comes there and he just wrecks Magua. He does, and I got the feeling that Magua just gave up at that point. Like he knew he wasn't winning that one.
And Uncas's father, he has this great weapon. It almost looks like a rifle.
Yeah.
And it was called a rifle club. And they called it that because it looked like a rifle stock, but it would have a spike in it. And he comes and he starts fighting with Magua, and he breaks one of Magua's arms, and at which point Magua tries to use his other arm to stab him, and then he breaks one of his legs. And Magua falls to his feet, and just like how Magua dispensed with Uncas, his father just gives him a quick blow to the skull, and it's all over.
Basically, after Magua gets killed, then the movie's all done, and it's final curtain call.
Yeah, except we've got one more powerful scene to come here. If your heartstrings haven't been tugged on enough, you've got Chingachgook and Cora and Hawkeye standing there, and Chingachgook is just in utter. Like we said, not only has his son died, but now he sees himself as the last of. And he says that one day all this land will be taken over and gobbled up and gone, and the red man will be totally killed off and die out.
And he says that the future of this place is for my white son, and he looks at Hawkeye. But then he looks over and he says, but someday there'll be no place for anybody in the white man.
And Hawkeye says, it's just your grieving heart talking, and he says, it's true. New people will come into this land, and they will find jobs, employment, and live and die. But once, we were, you just hear.
It really was a great ending, and I mean, they prophesied from hindsight, But things changed pretty quickly along the Hudson River. What happened in those next years after the French and War wrapped up?
Once the French were finally defeated and they lost all their hold on North America, it basically created a fast track for British settlement. Because on top of the French being gone, now any Native Americans that allied with the French, you could automatically just ignore any treaties from before with them. You can say, okay, you fought with the French, your land's now forfeit, now English. And it also really started to affect even the allied Indian nations that were joined with the English. Generations, they've been having this kind of cat and mouse relationship with the French and the English. And the French and the English are competing by trying to give them best terms, best trade goods on who they're going to help. But now that the French are gone, all they have to choose from is the English. And we're going to see the deals get worse and worse and worse for all the Native Americans. And colonies are just going to start coming in boatloads and expanding.
And if you want to learn more, you can obviously listen to our show because we've just finished the French and Indian War, but soon we're going to be talking about Pontiac and Gayasunta's rebellion. And then we'll be getting into the American Revolution, and then we'll be covering even more. So it's a gradual process, but Caleb's right. This is the turning point that just lets the wagon start rolling across the frontier.
You basically have to tune into Iroquois history and legend to hear the rest of the story because like they said, like you guys said, it's just going to keep going on and there's a lot more to hear. So this movie really gave us just a little taste of what's coming, and there's just so much history and culture to explore after this.
But it's important to note that, like we said earlier, the Mohicans or the Mohicans are not gone. The Six Nations are not gone. They're still here in New York. Now, do they have all their land that their ancestors have? No. Have they been oppressed by the government and other less than scrupulous people? Yes. But they're still here. And their culture is still here. And their way of life has been severely hampered. But they are still, God willing, going to be here for the rest of time, we would hope.
And thank you so much for joining us today in this throughway collaboration. It went surprisingly well. I'm shocked how well this went.
Yeah, we've been itching to do this with Steve for a while, and we really appreciate you, Steve, because when Andrew and I just were getting into podcasts, you were one of the people that was very supportive, and we'd been talking back and forth from emails, and Steve has been doing podcasts for a while. He has very good in-depth podcast called The History of the Papacy.
Papacy.
Papacy, it's the same thing. We got into an argument on this on another episode, too. And then why don't you tell us about your new show that we're actually doing here as a collaboration?
Well, as we said, it's beyond the big screen. And what I really hope to get out of the show is that we look at the backstory and what more than just what really happened, because I think you could see from the show, we weren't just nitpicking. Hawkeye would have had 4 buttons on his shirt instead of 7. I think we were really trying to dig into, give everybody a more richer story. And when I do these interviews, especially this one, I learn so much more about the movie. And I think that the movie really makes a lot more sense. And it's just a much more enjoyable experience when you can learn a little bit more about the backstory.
So did you like the movie?
Oh, I mean, how could you not like the movie? And I think this movie would have come out probably when I was in middle school or high school. So I think it's like one of those movies that when you see when you're young and it just sticks with you for the rest of your life.
I keep hoping that they'll make like a high budget miniseries on this whole part of the French and Indian War, because I think people would gobble it up. I saw this movie years ago, and I've always liked it, even before I knew anything about the French and Indian War. I don't even think, even when I saw this movie when it first came out, that I understood that this was the French and Indian War. But now, doing all the research we've done for our show, everything just fits into place, and you can really see what's going on, the drama of the stage.
Yeah, that's what I think a lot of movies like this would be so much better served instead of the decisions that they have to make to fit something into the 2.5 hour time frame. If they could stretch it out a little bit, they could really make a more full narrative. I think like with the mini series, or not the regular series, Turn on AMC, they have to add in like a lot of the romance and things like that probably didn't really happen, but they can also develop a lot of things better and just make it a more interesting story. And I think, like you said, something like the French and Indian War, if they stretch that out, you could fit in a lot of these sub stories that would that would just be really interesting. And I think people would learn a lot from them.
Totally agree. So I think that everybody should definitely tune into both of Steve's shows, History of the Papacy and Beyond the Big Screen.
And Iroquois History and Legends.
Thank you so much for being with us, everybody.
If you feel up to it, why don't you get on iTunes? And if you haven't already, leave a review for all 3 of our shows.
Yeah, let's leave lots of reviews.
Any review on Iroquois History and Legends will make you an honorary Wild Sweet Potato member.
And any review for Steve's shows will earn his... you do indulgences, right?
Yeah, you'll get many indulgences. And if you email me that you've left a message to the History of the Papacy, you will receive a special bonus episode.
Ooh, well, maybe I should do that then.
Watch the special episode be the Pope Mobile.
Yeah.
I think that's the finest episode on History of the Papacy. If any of you are wondering if this voice sounds familiar, that's because Steve and ourselves actually traded plugs for our April Fool's episode. So if you're thinking to yourselves, I know these voices. Where have I heard them before? Yes, we're the Pope Mobile guys. And Steve is Steve.
So thank you very much, everybody. We hope you have a great week, and we'll be seeing you soon.